Well, there we go with the indomitable Pat Benatar keeping us in good spirits at this very special thinking on the arms race. Where next? I'm Matt Dancona, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm delighted that you're all able to join us. We've got a terrific group of speakers. I always think that one of the kind of privileges of working for a slow media newsroom is that there is time to take stock and consider. And I think we've reached a point in the arms race campaign where it's time to do that. If you are familiar with the campaign, it was launched back in July, really, with a newscast which our co-founder James Harding did on the abject failure of the G7 summit in Carbis Bay to deliver on what it had been meant to do on vaccine equality. And since then, we've published quite a lot of journalism. We've launched a vaccine tracker, which my colleague Lara Spirit, who's running the chat tonight, will put a link to, I hope, in the chat. We've had today a terrific slow newscast by Kerry Thomas on the role of Pfizer in all of this, which I really recommend strongly to you to listen to. It's a fantastic piece of podcasting. And in tandem with all that, playing a part, building a coalition of partners from all around the world, groups like the COVID Collaborative, the Pandemic Action Network, playing a part in organising a letter that appeared in the Financial Times earlier this month from 109 public figures and organisations, and calling for a COVID summit and asking for 7 billion more doses before the end of 2021, an additional 7 billion by mid-2022. Now, that summit was held last week. You might not have known that if you're not a regular traveller to Tortoise, because it didn't get very much coverage. And a lot of people felt it was a summit barely worthy of its name. There was no real discussion. There were some new promises, 500 million doses for poorer nations for the United States, a partnership between the US and the EU on delivery, a target of vaccination of 70% by this time next year. It was an ignominious occasion, I think, for those of us who are British, because Boris Johnson, who's really talked a tough game on this, didn't even bother to turn up. He was meant to be the sixth speaker. So there's a kind of a moment of feeling, what was all that about? And I hope tonight we can establish that, work out what has been achieved, what hasn't, and where we should go now in the campaign. The questions to be asked is, where in this race between vaccines and variants have we actually got to? There's a moral issue. 10,000 to 11,000 people still die every day in the world from COVID. That's about 500 every hour. 4.6 billion people have not had a single shot. We know that the variants are still developing. And again, if I can direct you to our vaccine tracker, you'll see how they are moving around the world. There is a self-interest argument in getting the world vaccinated. Delta has been a very, very clear and very, very alarming warning of how serious variants can be. And it is a variant that has achieved partial vaccine escape, and it may augur another variant that will achieve full vaccine escape. So the warning is there. So the question is, what next? So we have a fantastic group of speakers, as I said, including people who we've been working with over the last few months on the arms race campaign. Dr. Krishna Udayakumar, who is the founding director of the Duke Global Health Innovation Center. Duke has played a huge role in enlightening the world to this issue, but also in vaccine testing and public diplomacy and diplomacy with the White House. And almost every front in this campaign, Duke has been at the forefront. Ditto the Pandemic Action Network, and we're delighted to welcome Eloise Todd, who's the co-founder of that group. Eloise will have, I think, quite a bit to say about where we've got, and I know had made some very interesting remarks in the immediate aftermath of the summit, and so looking forward to talking to her. And then Andy Cooper, editor of Health Policy Institute, Insight, which is and who's been a very important part of our pillar of our coverage of COVID generally, and knows almost everything there is to know, if not everything, about health policy. So welcome to you all, and to all of you who are joining us. Let's dive straight in. Krish, if I may start with you. Here we are on Monday. The summit was last Wednesday. What's your sort of capsule take on what it achieved and what it didn't?
Yeah, first, great to be with you, and thanks for leadership you and Tortoise are continuing to provide in this space as well. It's been fantastic to collaborate on this effort. I'd say our overall take is a small step forward, that first of all, President Biden, the White House, the US stepped forward, hosted a global COVID summit. So in some sense, they are starting to take a bit more ownership of the global response. We did see some new commitments, including new doses. Almost entirely lost in that conversation was the urgency of the need. So the US commitment to doses has now gone up to 1.1 billion, but only about 300 million of those doses to be made available by the end of this year, when dose donations, dose sharing is most urgent. We saw some commitments from philanthropies, from private organizations, from some other governments, none of them game changers, unfortunately, in the path forward. And what was glaringly obvious was that this was not a summit to have any sort of conversation. This was a lot of people giving 3-minute set pieces without any give and take. And so it made it even more odd that most of it wasn't actually broadcast in real time, when in fact it was designed not to have any real substantive conversation associated with it. What also was really clear in both the president's remarks, but also the structure, was that we still don't have strong leadership from a global sense. There is no multilateral institution or organization that has stepped up to be on point. We have the World Health Organization. It's got some capacities, significant challenges. We've got ACT-A, we've got COVAX, we've got the G7, we've got the G20, none of whom are seen as in charge of the global response. So it leaves us without a lack of accountability, without anything beyond the commitments that were made, similarly to vague commitments that have been made throughout, including at the G7.
Chris, I mean, it's very interesting you make that point, because one of the things James wrote a piece for the New York Times earlier in the year, calling for presidential envoy and recommending that George W. Bush be made that envoy. Now, it's quite surprising that after all the debate and all of the sort of preamble to the summit, that, as you say, we've emerged from the summit with lots of robust rhetoric, some new commitments, but again, as you say, nothing that really improves and enhances the structures and infrastructures of delivery, especially a failure to identify an individual who can be, if you like, the chairman of the board.
Right. That's exactly right. That we don't have a presidential envoy, we don't have a UN special representative or envoy, we don't have anything of that sort. And everybody steps up to say they are responsible for various pieces of it, but it's still totally lacking coordination to be effective. And what we've taken away from this is that it's going to take independent work to create some models of accountability. So with many of our partners, the path that we're now moving forward in terms of next step is really to say what we have to create is a robust, credible, transparent, independent accountability hub that tries to match all of the commitments that have been made with real actions, that allows for transparency of what's being done and what's not. And importantly, moves the conversation from Washington, New York, Geneva to actual countries, the ones that are struggling, the low and middle income countries around the world. We need to empower more of their own leadership and their own voices to help us understand what's happening on the ground, what the needs are, and how we can meet them, whether it's through multilateral institutions, bilateral initiatives, whatever the need might be.
Krish, we'll come back to you very shortly, but I'd like to turn, if I may, to Eloise. Eloise, you responded to the summit with what I suppose I would characterize as cautious optimism. How are you feeling now, a few days on?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because we've been asking for all of this to happen for more than a year. We've been asking for leaders to convene. We've been asking for global coverage to be a target. When the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, ACT-A as we call it, was set up, it was only ever set up with a mandate to cover 20% of people in low and middle income countries. And there's just been this sense that the multilateral effort from the outset has always been playing catch up with the state of the pandemic. And instead of preparing for worst case scenarios or even likely scenarios, there's been a bit of wishful thinking and best case scenario planning. So the reason we are cautiously optimistic is, for the first time, we have leaders putting themselves on the line to say, you know what, we actually need to get this job done at a global scale. And believe it or not, apart from platitudes, we haven't had that level of commitment with numbers and numerical targets until now. Now, targets are just targets. There's a whole host of things that we need to do now to make sure this isn't just a false promise. Krishna was talking about accountability, which would be super important. But first of all, we're also very keen to make sure that the actions set out by the White House actually do ladder up to that 70% coverage target, the access to PPE, oxygen, tests and other treatments everywhere, because there's a little bit of a mixed bag, even in the White House targets document. They've sort of set these top line objectives, then set some actions to the end of the year, yet we don't have an alignment around the 40% target of the WHO. So there's some work to do even on the top line targets, I'd say. And then there's well, who should do what to get there? And that's where we come in terms of, Pandemic Action Network is 140 organizations, ranging from CSOs to partners like Duke, to the private sector, to foundations. And what we want to be able to do is to come together and basically, give people their marching orders, give countries and companies their marching orders, and say, this is what we need you to do by December, by February, by April, by the middle of next year, and hold them accountable. And in order to have a proper push at that, we all need to be on the same page with that. I would say there were a couple of things that are reasons to be cheerful in the summit outcome. There's a commitment that you might even miss about transparency of global production and supply chains. And this, if the US government is really committed to opening up the black box, which is who is producing what, and how many vaccines are coming off the production line, how many tests, how many treatments, then this would help us enormously. I give a nod to the brilliant work of the Launch and Scale Speedometer that is on the Duke University website, and indeed your own Tortoise vaccine tracker. But actually some of those numbers, if we're not careful, it's really important to look at what's actually delivered, because the commitments make the countries sound great and generous, but if they're all too far ahead and they haven't actually been delivered on the ground or administered, then we have a problem. So we're looking for the global dashboard of dashboards, and we think that we want to work with partners like Krishna and others to have that accountability piece that's independent. But frankly, we also want the multilateral leaders task force to do its job. And really, it's done a good job at some gap analysis, but what's it there for? What's it who's leading that? And as we've already talked about, who's in charge? We need proper political leadership. And I think the difference that it made last week, having Biden set the agenda, admittedly a modest start really, given where we are in the crisis, but the real power of last week is about the targets document, the promise of accountability, the convenings that Blinken and Biden and Harris have promised to do, the commitment of Draghi to work with the G20 together with them, and also this US-EU partnership on vaccination, which could be a really important political bit of coordination on the supply chain side as well. So, the problem with these things is it a success? We'll see in, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, but put it like this: it's the first time we've been set up for potential success, and we will throw everything we have at it to make sure that we get there.
Absolutely. But Eloise, I mean, it's interesting you use the metaphor of the dashboard, which I totally agree with. But to stick with that metaphor, or to slightly adapt it, what provides the roadmap in this plan, and what crucially is the engine? What's the thing that's actually forcing this along?
You mean in terms of who's going to come up with the roadmap?
Well, I mean, A, is there a roadmap? Because I can't see one. And B, even if there is one, what is the engine of power and levers being pulled that will actually move along, you know, the global community to real measurable to get jabs and arms? Yeah,
so you're right, there isn't a roadmap. And in a sense, you know, the targets are an excellent start. We need to, you know, the world leaders agreeing we need to get to 70% vaccination coverage. Well, great, but how are you going to do that? The next step is the very complex roadmap, which is, of course, the longer it takes to roll out the vaccines, the more you have to have a plan on tests and treatments and PPE and all the rest of it. So the roadmap contains, we always talk about vaccines as the sort of easiest, most digestible thing to understand, but the full roadmap is actually about all of the tools in the COVID equation and how you get those to people everywhere. So I think that's where we'd be looking to work with the White House, to work with the multilateral leaders task force, to say, it's really nice you're doing this gap analysis. You talk about this 50 billion target. Where are the workings? What is it country by country? You talk about 10 to 12 countries having absorptive capacity issues. Which are they? How can we help? How can we make sure that this goes from a sort of top line strategic buy-in to really understanding the nuts and bolts of, right, we need advocates in a country over here to push for all these things to happen. So I think we need to use the energy of the advocacy community, which is committed and really keen to push things in the right direction. But we need the information that is held by governments and countries in terms of when are they getting doses, what's coming off the production line, when, and to use all that data to make our advocacy smarter. And in terms of what the imperatives are to act, I mean, you know, apart from I think we have to tell the story increasingly to our public citizens, but also to governments, about the self-interest angle. I mean, it can't be the case that governments across the world are not aware that if a variant comes which undermines the current vaccines, obviously that would have a devastating impact. And we all know that it simply makes no sense to not invest tens of billions when another variant could cost trillions. So, but I still think we can't assume that that sort of fact and reality has been digested fully by political leaders who are always on a sort of short-term horizon and have a responsibility to their own people. We have to do a better job as campaigners, I think, to link those messages, to say that actually what happens overseas is really going to have an impact on you at home. So I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can also do together in the next year as we support this global vaccine rollout with other COVID tools as well.
No, I'm sure that's right. Thank you, Eloise. We'll come back to you as well. Can I go to Andy now, who's been our sort of one of our gurus throughout all this? And you wrote a very interesting piece, Andy, about which really struck a chord with me, which was that your argument was multilateralism is great, but actually what you need to do is also mobilize national self-regard and the competitive spirit. And I wonder whether there's something in that which, in the wake of this summit, we need to take stock of, which is that perhaps there should be more naming and shaming. Perhaps we should be mobilizing competition. Perhaps we should be, you know, putting up a league table. Perhaps we should be telling nations that are falling behind that they're falling behind, and rather than assuming that a kind of numinous multilateral solution is just going to arise out of thin air.
That's right, I think. The challenge to get the communication of this right, because communications is the bit I think I know a little about. The challenge is to get the tone one that will be effective with the governments and the donors and the people who we need to get engaged in making this work positively and promptly. So it would seem to me that we have to redouble efforts on explaining the enlightened self-interest case, that actually we do need to get the rest of the world vaccinated, because the more unvaccinated populations, the higher the possibility of a vaccine escaping variant of COVID-19 arising. And the economic self-interest argument that sits alongside that, total cost of the pandemic to the world has obviously been catastrophically huge. And I think it's reasonably coherent, bulletproof argument to say we actually need to invest to get everybody some level of protection to this. And it did occur to me that going alongside those more positive arguments, actually some transparency and some league tables and presenting it positively, because governments around the world have obviously just had massive holes blown in their exchequers by COVID-19. They may therefore not instantly be springing to become philanthropic. But it would feel to me as if we can frame this positively by saying, actually, EU, you're going to buddy with West Africa, or Canada, you're going to buddy with Azerbaijan, and just try and form some thing that gives people, firstly, a sense of ownership of going to help with another part of the world which hasn't got necessarily the wealth, the infrastructure, the things that in the developed world we take for granted. Harness, not do it as a frontline stated objective, but actually have the stick and the carrot approach towards getting governments to act.
And Andy, you've also written very interestingly about COVAX and the World Health Organization. In the wake of what happened last week, how are you feeling about, and given the fact that there isn't a sort of a new central point of direction, dirigism, how do you feel about the ability of those bodies to handle what lies ahead?
So my sense is that this will go faster if we can manage to with organizations like Tortoise, organizations like Duke, organizations like the Pandemic Network. Actually, I think if we wait for a global body, one single global body to lead this, there are significant dangers that we get bogged down in infighting, etc. It feels more as if we need to get some momentum, some impetus behind getting a better global understanding, frankly, among governments and among people, that really there is urgency with this. There is a strong positive case to be made for helping the rest of the world. And my sense is that by using effective arguments and good communications, we might possibly be able to go further faster. My concern about waiting for one global leader organization to emerge and have a plan that everyone buys into is simply a pragmatic one.
Do you think COVAX has the muscle necessary to do what is demanded of it, though? Because the evidence so far suggests, however well-meaning the people involved are, which is very, that it doesn't.
I mean, yes, it's challenging to, it's kind of the old Stalin quote, isn't it? How many battalions has the Pope? How many battalions has COVAX got? Where is their hard power? And I suppose my inclination towards a soft power-led approach, and an approach that's led by communications, arguments, transparency, and getting countries to feel good about being involved with this, getting organizations, countries, governments to feel, actually, okay, well, we're going to stick it to our neighbors who, and we're going to do much, much better than them. I think if we can harness people's, the organic desire to be competitive, to do well, on the part of the wealthier countries in the world, my feeling is just we will get further faster.
It's really interesting. I'd like to bring in our co-founder James Harding, not least because I sort of feel like I'm the mid-year to his Bob Geldof in all of this, and the guy at the back with the synthesizer while you do all the hard work. And it's interesting though. I mean, we've talked so much about this, and it started off with that brilliant newscast you did on Carbis Bay, and here we are a few months later, and it's hard to deny there is a sense, isn't there, of deflation at what actually happened last week. So I guess my question, James, is where's your head at on all this, and where do you think we go next, not just as Tortoise but more generally with the coalition?
I'm to be honest with you, I'm much closer to Krishna, and I'm much more downbeat than Eloise and Andy. In fact, I think that there's something embarrassing about being in your early 50s and discovering quite how, foolish and naive you are, because we went through the G7 summit, and the thing that was shocking was the Sunday before, thinking that when Boris Johnson said he was going to bring the world's leaders together to commit to vaccinate the world by the end of next year, I sort of thought that you would only announce that if you had a plan to do it. And you can't help but feeling that when President Biden decides, okay, we've spent a fair amount of time behind the scenes canvassing opinion from people like Krishna, amongst others, but from a whole bunch of G7, G20 multilateral organizations, and then you pull together this rather weird karaoke summit of leaders, you at least know the song that everyone's going to sing, and at the end of it there's going to be a sort of rousing moment where everyone comes together and says, here's how we get to, not just that we get to 70% by this time next year, but here's how we get there, and here's what every single person in the plan is going to do, right? There are weddings that are better organized. You would have thought that everyone would have known their speaking. So I think, Matt, the truth is, so I agree with Krishna. There's a problem, which is there is no leadership. I'm not sure that's fixable, the proven, state of things. I think that there is a real mistake here, which is headline numbers are actually misleading, i.e., oh, hooray, the US is committed to 1.1, right? But it's 1.1 mostly well into 2022. And I'm even skeptical about the 300 million, because so many of these now are shared doses, and the doses arrive too late to be able to distribute it to the countries that really need them. So I'm worried about that. And I think, and this is maybe for Liz and for Giles and for you really, which is what does a little organization like ours do, right? What can we really do? I think that there's a reasonable thing that we can do, which is do what you've always said, which is just a lot of journalism. Let's commission people to make the point. Let's have Kerry doing his podcast. So I think we can do a little more journalism. There's a question I've got, which, as I say, is probably a bit for Liz and for Giles, which is, we talk a lot about being a place where our members drive our journalism. Well, could we actually get organized and say, look, there's a job to be done here, which is to scrutinize, I think, the organizations that are your natural allies. One of the things that I worry about a little bit is we look to Gates to help with this. We look to Rockefeller. We look to Ford. Well, really, what are they actually doing? What are they organizing, and what are they delivering? And some of it may be great, but some of it may not. But we don't really scrutinize it. I think that I appreciate Andy's point about, let's be positive, let's incentivize competition. I think we could do a little bit of, the stick as well. I think we could identify in personal terms who are the politicians that have been least committed to this, which ones are the high hoarders and the low givers. I think we can do the same for the pharmaceutical companies. And then I think there's a job for us to do, which is really painstaking but valuable, which is, I think, around media organizations. No one wants us basically, helicoptering in to countries around the world and reporting on vaccine inequality, but we could really begin to coordinate other media organizations to report it. That is a really painstaking job. And so I don't know, the reason I mentioned Giles is, you remember the moonshot, Matt, where we said, how do you get to 2030 net zero? And Giles orchestrated a bunch of people, and Liz and I have been talking a bit about how do you go from being a membership organization where people air what they think on thinkings like this to saying, okay, how do you put our membership to work? And I don't have a good answer to it. But that's what I'm trying to work out, because it feels to me as though we've started something. We were rather naive in hoping that a summit would be convened, the government would take it on, commit to a set of targets, and we'd sort of cheer. That doesn't seem to have happened.
Well, I'm not sure it is naive. I mean, I think the interesting thing is that the point you made at the start, really, which is that we've grown up in a world in which when world leaders hold a summit, they tend to have something to say at the end of it.
Yeah.
One thinks of Glen Eagles, which you mentioned in your original newscast, and the contrast could scarcely be more poignant, really. I mean, the difference is one of kind as well as degree, and it makes one reframe one's expectations, I think, of what modern statesmanship is composed of, in and not in a good way.
Completely. I see Charles got his hand up. I'm hoping, as with so much at Tortoise, when there's something really to be done, let's get Charles.
All right, I'm going to go to Charles and then Liz. Charles, good to see you. Tell us what we should be doing.
Helicoptering in to prove the point. So James says no one wants us helicoptering in to report on low vaccination. But my immediate thought is, well, maybe not us. We may not be resourced to do it. But personally, I would like someone, and I mean, whether it's helicoptered in or a local journalist, to do precisely that and prove the concept, prove the need. The only reason I say this, and James, I have alluded to it occasionally in emails, is that when COVAX first sent vaccines to Ghana, as far as I recall, virus prevalence was very low, and the case for sending them was one of equity rather than urgency. And I want to read a story. I mean, I don't want any country to have to be the guinea pig, but I do want to read the story that says this is what happens. I suppose Paul did this in Tunisia in a sense, but I think we need. You asked earlier, what can we do as a small newsroom beyond journalism? To be very honest, my gut feeling at this point is we shouldn't we shouldn't be attempting to do more than journalism. I think to do a lot of very good journalism is a very noble aim. I think that may be what we're equipped to do. And I think we need to do more of showing what happens in low-income countries when you don't have the vaccine.
I get, Charles, my point about helicoptering, just so you're clear, is that if you think about it, if you think about, the sort of Paradise Papers, Pegasus, those big concerted journalistic efforts, as great as those stories are, and they're amazing stories, what you don't see these days is a concerted effort around COVID coverage. You don't, you know, and that's the question I've got is, could you create that kind of coalition where we're all reporting on it? Because even if you take Kerry's coverage of Pfizer today, what we don't really have is a voice in, you know, any African country really saying, look, this is the frustration we've got. We're getting these doses, they're coming later than we thought. Because they're delayed, they've got a shorter shelf life. It's going to be much harder to, you know, you can see where I'm going. And that would be quite an interesting thing if we created a network that was actually covering this.
Yeah, sure. And that, sorry, I am clear now. That's still a journalistic job, but it's more a coordination of journalism.
Yeah.
I just think it's important to stick pretty close to our core competency.
Thanks, Charles. Could I come to Liz Mosley now, who I know has some thoughts. Liz, are you there? Hey, Liz.
Hello. So because I'm not a journalist, and I agree with Giles that we should stick to our core competency, one of the things I wonder about the way we've approached this is because we've been broadly targeting the grown-ups, as James said, you know, we've gone to the people we've thought, here's the White House, here's the WHO, here's the UN, and we've tried to make people understand in the way that it should work. And I don't know where I've got this from. It's in my head from a recent, maybe it was a thinking, so I can't credit the person who said it, but making people understand is nowhere near as potent as making them care. And I don't know that we have found a way to make people, and when I say people, I mean ordinary people, so let's say Tortoise members, really properly care. And in order to do that, perhaps we could, in addition to the journalism, we could approach this more as how you would approach a communications campaign, because we do know people who are really, really good at that, and we haven't utilized any of them so far. And then if you have that, then you can start thinking about who are our partners in the network and what are their, you know, we can mobilize lots and lots and lots of individual people if we have something that is very small and precise to ask them to do. To Louise Simpson's point, who said, I am very happy to be put to work, I just don't know what to do. And I don't think we've given people, lots and lots of individual people, a clear and precise thing to do. And that's because we don't have a unifying, very simple communications idea. I mean, this is how Brexit was won. You know what I mean? Very simple communications idea, and we haven't got that in the arms race.
Just to mention that we've I think Lara has put links to pieces we've run from India, Afghanistan, Brazil, and Tunisia, just as a sort of starter for 10 on that front. Liz, just before I mean, you know, does your take on it from, you know, you are a very good journalist, but notionally outside the journalistic world, is there enough humanization in this campaign?
No.
Because it seems to me that one of the things that successful campaigns all have in common is that they stretch a hand out to the person they're trying to mobilize and say, this is what it means.
I think to be fair, we shouldn't give ourselves a hard time about this, or particularly, I haven't particularly been very close to it, but all of you who've, you know, pulled up trees and trying to make the thing happen, we shouldn't give yourself a hard time about approaching the structures that are in place to keep the world from sort of ending itself, to believe that those structures are there for a reason, that people do the right thing and that it can happen. Don't give yourself a hard time for believing in those things. Those things aren't delivering, so we sort of have to try something a little bit different. It's a bit like, you know, you buy the best customer relationship management system that exists in the world, it costs you a fortune, it takes 3 years to put it in, it goes massively over budget, runs late. You still have to do the scrappy workarounds to do the thing that you could do before. And I think that's maybe a thing that's worth a shot, is to think a bit dirtier about it.
And also, I think perhaps to show a little bit more indignation. I mean, it strikes me that it's extraordinary that I can order a book from Australia and it arrives the next day. And, you know, I have innumerable apps on my phone that will organize through algorithm almost any connection I want. And it seems to be beyond the wit of national governments to get doses into arms in DRC or South Africa or Nepal.
What we have learned is that people don't need to understand how or why in order to really properly get behind an idea, whether the idea is a sort of malignant negative thing or a progressive, exciting, brilliant thing. And so it's just a case of finding a way to, people just want a wave to ride.
Yes.
And I think that we haven't given them the wave.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much, Liz. Can I come back to Eloise, who I know wanted to moderate her optimism, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to underline that I think we have potential now, but that doesn't mean we're anywhere near getting the job done. But it's taken us 18 months to get to this level of potential. And I think that all of us, whatever we work in, have to think about why is it that it's taken so long, frankly, for the penny to drop for leaders to say, hang on a minute, we might need to sort out this global angle. And just to come back to the comms element that you're just discussing, like the role of the media, the role of Tortoise, this very fundamental question, which is, how do you get normal people on the street just interested in the fact or fearful about the fact that, I'm quite worried about COVID because it's still going on in Asia, in Africa, in these different places. And actually, I'm worried about the lack of equity because this doesn't make any sense because we might be breeding more variants, etc. And so I think the comms challenge is, the sort of, what's the take back control for that, right? What's the 3-word bit of magic that can actually communicate some of that? And it's, for a long time, a lot of leaders, many of whom I admire, were saying no one's safe till everyone's safe, but it doesn't quite hit you. There needs to be a little bit of storytelling about, how we get from A to B, how we're going to get from, the state we're in now to a much freer way of living. And I think don't forget, this isn't an abstract concept to everybody in rich countries has now lived lockdowns, not being able to see people, maybe even losing loved ones. This is an incredibly emotive and experiential thing that everybody's gone through together. So surely we can sort of really get through to people and help them understand that if you don't want the risk of that again, for just a few mere tens of billions, it will dwarf the kind of trillions that we might have to spend if we get to another round of a variant that undermines. So I think that is a comms challenge. And I think we need to help governments out and help them make the case for international efforts. And that's something I think we can all put our minds to. But yeah, just on the optimism piece, it's honestly, I'm going to post some links in the chat, including our quite nerdy, but all of the things we've sent to ACTA, the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, and COVAX, for the ways in which we think it should reform, and all of that. There's a lot that needs to change. We are not kind of, starry-eyed about any of this, but at least Biden stood up. At least we have ongoing efforts. There's another summit in Q1. There's this ongoing effort. We just have to make it. We don't have a choice. It has to succeed.
Thank you, Eloise. I couldn't agree more. Chris, can I come back to you? Because it seems to me that there's a very interesting strategic question, which is kind of, we're seeing convergence on it here, which is we've been involved in a phase of constructive diplomacy, and we have at the very least reached a punctuation mark in that process. Is there actually a need to mobilize more indignation and dismay? I mean, without becoming hyperbolic, to involve people and link up all the amazing work that the various groups, not least Duke, have been doing to a popular movement. And of course, one saw that, with the Global Citizen concert over the weekend, and that's a worthy endeavor, but it's a one-off. That we need something here that actually has a shelf life, has a period of time that is not really in existence yet, I think.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. If we go back and look at history, when the world finally responded to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, it was because of a series of groups that were very non-traditional in working together. You had certainly the activist movement, but coupled to faith-based communities. If you think about the launch of PEPFAR by President George W. Bush, it was bringing together lots of uncommon or non-traditional organizations and activist communities. What we, I think, lack now is that same type of model, where if this is seen more and more as populism and nationalism versus some progressive multilateralism in a conceptual way, we're not going to win. So who are the non-traditional alliances? Where are they? Where is the leadership from the business community? Where is the faith-based community in talking about this, both in terms of humanitarian need, but also in terms of self-interest? I might go as far to say there is a messaging campaign that may actually be aligned to what we heard in Brexit. The way to take back control is actually to make sure that people in India and Africa and Latin America are actually vaccinated if we're going to take back control of our own lives. And so how do we think about this differently? That's not the traditional progressive messaging around humanitarian. And I think Eloise said this well, saying no one is safe till everyone is safe has totally lost any use in that phrase.
It's a fascinating, take on it, because I think that something we've been discussing is, you alluded to the HIV/AIDS example, is, the example of Larry Kramer, and you can see on YouTube the amazing speech he gave, in which he just uses the word plague, and it's one of the most evocative and powerful speeches of any sort I've ever seen. I'd like to, in that spirit, I'd like to, if I may, just borrow Laura from the chat briefly. Sorry, Laura, to multitask you, but as many of you may know, Laura, before much to our benefit, joined Tortoise, was a leading light in the People's Vote campaign and other campaigns, and is a very distinguished and experienced campaigner. And so I guess, Laura, the question I'm really putting you on the spot is, you've seen and you have built strategies. When a campaign hits a moment like this, where there are some grounds for hope, but not much by way of concrete, reasons to sort of cling to, what do you do? Do you plow on, or do you actually reset?
My view is that it's so self-evident what needs to happen, right? Like, it's so obvious what needs to happen, that this idea that we're going to just sort of push making the same case again and we're going to come up good, it just doesn't seem particularly hopeful for me. I do think that the language that we've been using has been pretty forgiving, pretty understanding. We're now in a situation where, Johnson has acted totally shamefully over this. To be not even present at the meeting last week, let alone join half a dozen, if not more, other nations in upping their commitment, is really embarrassing and really shocking. And so the idea that we treat this as a sort of, and be kind of quite fluffy and diplomatic about it all, when, as various people tonight have echoed, the next few months crucially are the most important ones. And it's not the pledges themselves, but the fact that by the end of the year, we really need to have seen a massive upping in doses deliveries. The UK is one of, if not the worst, for having delivered on the pledges they've already made. And we've not even made enough pledges, right? We've given like 9% of the 100 million doses that we pledged, and we pledged them a very long time and haven't so far got any plans to give many more. So I just don't feel particularly optimistic that if we kind of trundle along with the same language and tactics that we have done, that we're going to necessarily get where we want to be. I think there's not been kind of a real escalation in the language on this in the way that there maybe should be. I don't think in the UK, I was saying kind of in the chat talking to Zav about this, but what I found interesting in the last few days, especially with the Biden summit, is how among certainly the progressive left, or those reporting in that way in the US, there's definitely been a real focus on linking vaccination, domestic vaccination, whatever it may be around vaccination, with the foreign commitments. And we just don't have that here. Like we don't, as a media, have a kind of real interest in this topic. The people that went with Johnson to the US didn't really ask him about it. There wasn't really any sense in which he'd be responsible or held account for the fact there weren't any added kind of pledges. So you know, it's difficult because the last campaigns that you were just talking about were campaigns, and at Tortoise there's I think the journalism that we've done so far has been really brilliant, and there's definitely a really important role for that. But I think insofar as we talk, or we considering the messaging that we're using on this, there's a huge case for being a lot more forthright and a lot more unhappy about what's happened so far and what needs to happen soon. I think it's kind of time for us to, in some ways, lose our patience a little bit, but that's just my view.
And do you think that we should lose our patience? I mean, obviously, we, you know, absolutely, to Charles's point, want to continue we'll double down on doing reports from other countries. But in terms of the sort of strategic focus, should we be focusing as a UK-based news organisation upon the failures of the UK government?
Yeah, I mean, I just think before last week, there was a case that everyone in the G7 had done really badly, and that we can kind of focus collectively on this kind of joint guilt that we should all be feeling. Actually, you know, the UK is now worse than all of the others in my opinion. And, you know, as one of the largest stockpilers in the world, to be completely absent last week, to then not follow it up with added pledges or commitments at all, and for the media to be so collectively disinterested, you know, all three of those things, I think, speak to the fact that we here at Tortoise in the UK should be pressing this point really, really hard. We've got one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. We are incredibly well placed to be doing this. And we are also, you know, incredibly beholden to the collective goodwill of the international community ahead of COP. So it just seems like there's this kind of collection of things which mean that it's massively in our interest to push the UK case a lot harder, and that they should be doing more. So I would go for the UK, but, you know, I don't know. I'm losing hope, as you know, Matt.
Actually, I don't think you are, but I hear what you're saying, if that makes any sense. Can we go back to Andy now, because I wanted to ask him particularly about the sort of specific relationship between the domestic and the international, because one point that was made to me very early on in this was there's no real analog for this kind of campaigning, because let's say when you were, I mean, I jokingly referred to Live Aid earlier, but, you know, as someone said to me, the difference is there wasn't famine in Guildford when Live Aid was going on. The problem in this instance is that COVID, though in a very different way, much reduced, vanishingly small death rate compared to developing nations, is still a serious, clear and present problem in developing nations, in developed nations, by the way. So is that part of the problem, that COVID is so all-consuming in our sort of national conversation, the way that we're now watching the rollout, you know, the consequences for the NHS, possibly for other aspects of the economy? It's very hard for people to look beyond that to the internet, you know, as logical as it is to do so. Emotionally, it's very hard to get beyond your domestic concept of COVID to the necessity of the global concept.
I think that's absolutely right, and that's one of the reasons why I was trying to suggest the dynamic of encouraging transparency and publishing league tables and competition between developed, wealthy countries to be the best donor, to be a really good player, because, you know, it is not stupid that we would want our governments to have sought to, you know, vaccinate us and to get us beyond the point, you know, hopefully we may now in the UK be reaching the fabled herd immunity. It's early days, but, you know, the signs are becoming more encouraging. So while there is definitely a place for the righteous anger that, you know, Lara's frankly dying to see unleashed, and I think that has to be part of any successful strategy, we do have to sort of have that element to it, and we have to have stories of people. We have to have stories of the kid in Afghanistan who is, when's he or she going to be vaccinated? You know, we need stories of people, because they're always very engaging. But, you know, so it seems to me Tortoise as a media organization has got a really strong possibility to be kind of a convener of wider journalism to achieve some of these goals. And it feels very much as if we will take populations with us, we will take readerships with us, and have a greater likelihood of having an impact on the decision makers who we need to do things differently. If we achieve these things not by constantly punching on the same bruise, that'll be effective. And of course, one of the things about running a campaign is once you're getting really sick of delivering your message, most people are just starting to hear it for the first time. So there's an element of persistence that has to go on, I think, with taking this forward. There's transparency. I think one of the things that's coming across most strongly is the need to actually interrogate the pledges that have been made. What actually is being delivered. And it would feel as if the World Health Organization's regional presences might also be very good networks to link in with, because you know they will have people who are very close to the delivery or lack of delivery. So those feel like important things. As for persuading people of the case for action, I mean, I wonder whether we one possible 3-word phrase is, security begins abroad.
It's interesting that we're all now channeling our inner Dominic Cummings to a certain extent to try and come up with slogans, and maybe that's no bad thing. Very sadly, we're coming to the end of the hour. And I can only speak for myself. I think James would like to come back in. James, are you there?
Matt, sorry, I hadn't realized the time because it's been such an interesting conversation, got me all wound up. The only thing I'll just say is there is a problem here which goes to Andy's point and Krishna's earlier, which is that the no one's safe until we are all safe is not working.
Exactly.
And so there's a really deeper question, which is, are we moving into a world that cares less than it did 20 years ago about, or 15 years ago, about what happens to people in places poorer than our own?
Yes, I mean, it obviously isn't getting that idea across at all, and it's now being battered into cliche anyway, so it has no purchase at all. So you're right. We need to think of new words and new language, and write quick. Having said all that, I have to say I end the hour fortified and determined not to give up. Krish very rightly emphasized that there was, as important as the summit was in the fact that it was held at all, there was still an absence of leadership. And I think a theme that came out in a number of contributions was that we are clearly at some sort of point in the history of multilateralism, post-war multilateralism, where our old assumptions about how it works and how it operates and the seriousness with which it's taken by its participants is changing dramatically. I think Eloise provided us with a kind of why this is important pledge card, so to speak, but also rightly talked about the difficulties of not being clear where the engineers or where the roadmap is. And I'm still attracted to Andy's idea of mobilizing national competition, because I think that sort of feeds into what James was saying more generally about the need to get the stick out and start to wield it, to name and shame politicians who are or are not stepping up to the plate. Ditto pharmaceutical companies. Again, do listen to Kerry's podcast. And also media organizations need to be brought in and made as much part of the coalition as other groups. And I absolutely agree with Giles that I think that we are at heart a news organization. We should be pursuing and doubling down on the ground in the kill zones of COVID, which are truly horrific and are scandalously undercovered, really, better covered in America, but very, very underreported in this country. We haven't had the Michael Burke moment that transformed what was an issue of famine into a national campaign in 1985 with Band-Aid. There hasn't been that moment. COVID, of course, is a more complicated problem, but there hasn't been that moment of emotional clarity. And I agree too with what Liz said, that we should be ruthless with our comms and not afraid to mobilize strong emotions and clear patriotic ideals in that, and to again reach out to people and make them feel this is something that affects them and not just people in power. They're not just supplicants to people in power, they're actually citizens, which seems to me to be something that's lost. I was very struck by what Krish had to say about the precedent of HIV/AIDS. I think what happened with ACT UP, the bond that formed between Larry Kramer and Fauci out of that is a very salutary story about how activism and establishment approaches to this can work together. And there isn't a Larry Kramer of vaccine inequality, which is a considerable mix. And I finish by endorsing in every word that Lara said about the need to be more indignant and impatient. But above all else, thank you all very much for coming this evening. Thank you to Krish, to Eloise and Andy for being such brilliant speakers. We fight on, we fight to win. We're going to keep going at this. We'll be coming back to you and asking for your help in times to come. But thank you for offering us such an interesting insight into where we should be going after this very important break point in the campaign, which I fear is going to take as long as it has to, and we'll be there all the way. Have a great evening, and we'll see you very soon, hopefully at tomorrow's Open News meeting. Bye for now.